Beautiful day outside.
Yes, it is.
Very nice. Thanks for being here and for spending part of it with us and thinking about the Bible. So now for something different than what you've been doing before. Yeah? Switching gears back towards the scriptures. And you read and thought today about the Davidic monarchy. So we'll start with that, with those kind of questions and issues. And then after we've exhausted that topic, maybe not, but after we've talked about it enough, then we will switch and we'll talk about exile and return, and that'll be material that I sort of present and then we discuss together. And then when we end our time today, we'll try to sort of bridge the gap between what happens after the return of the exile to what happens in the time between that and when Jesus is born, so that we have kind of what they call the intertestamental period, at least talked about a little bit, but we won't go into great detail because there's a lot of detail that we could go into. So let's start with the material that you worked with for today. So I got a couple of emails, and then I know other people have stuff that they have brought that's written. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of the dominant figure, in this time period with David, and kind of how that story of David and Bathsheba plays into or works its way into our canon, and how it sort of lives in our theological canon as Christians, and then what kind of issues that brings up. So you all already worked a little bit on this, so I'd like to hear from you. I have read a little bit of some of what some of you have written, but not all of you, and no one else has read what you have written. So I'd like for you to just summarize a little bit your work, what questions came to mind for you. And I want to, of course, remind you that there's no, it's not as though anybody gets the last word here. There's no definitive interpretation. All right, so we just were curious to hear what you have thought and what stood out to you. So anybody want to go first?
I think we all seem to think so much. We learned that what a great king David was and everything, and he really wasn't always a very nice person at all.
Yeah.
And this story exemplified how bad he can be. It was interesting reading some of the further things that it's very possible that some of these kings really were lousy people that they had to make look positive in order to set it for an example to be shown. So, but I think the thing that keeps getting brought up is that even though he was extremely fallible as a person, David remained faithful to God, and so God remained faithful to David. Where I had a big problem with things was that David's punishment seemed to be taken out on everybody else except for David. I mean, he got to watch some of it, but it wasn't nearly as impactful on him as it was to the people who hadn't committed the sin.
So what I hear from you is that you get all the regular sort of theological interpretations of the text, and that's all fine. Like David was chosen and David is faithful, even though David is really fallible. But that means that there's a lot of friction points between you and the story that don't get resolved, and they can't be resolved, and it leaves a lot of loose ends that are just bothersome. Because the story isn't about those people. Right, the story's about David, but that doesn't mean that those people don't matter or they don't live in our imaginations and make us wonder.
Look at God's fidelity through it all, no matter that undying love, no matter what. He's going to keep His covenant with you as long as you do your half of the bargain, basically. If you wander and stray from that, if you try and put yourself above God, or think that somehow you are, just because God has called you, you are somehow more important than anybody else, and you stray from what He wants you to do, there's that discipline factor too. He's going to call you on it and say, hey, kind of like, as I call it, a frying pan moment. You know, it's like the wife in the kitchen wanted to get the attention of her husband, and then boom, you know, it's like, whoa, I guess I screwed up, you know.
And that God's very much an actor in the story too. You know, even though David is a character, primary character, that God functions in the story and has a personality or has a force, right? And it primarily speaks to the prophets, but gets the job done, right? It communicates what needs to be communicated. So God ends up being part of the narrative. So in a way, the story is as much about, for you, then about who God is, as it is who David is.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, when I read it, I knew that the Israelites had been asking for a king for a long time, and then they got this string of kings that were not always as satisfactory as they might have liked. And so,
It's a polite way of putting it.
Yeah. and you know, they talk about David being a great king, and I could see this story serving as a reminder to not trust too much in earthly kings because they are flawed. But it's also a reminder that God works through those flawed people. I think, you know, I think it was interesting to me that many cultures at that time, the leader was equated with the divine, and David's flaws kind of help keep you from making that elevation to that level.
Right. So this is in some ways a little different than some other cultures, where if you are elevated to king, then you are elevated near to the divine. Whereas in these stories, we have very human, very flawed kings. Right. So what I hear from you is some theological work, right? So the text teaches us something about God, and that God's faithfulness to the people, in part, is giving them a king, right? Because eventually they get their way, and God goes ahead and gives them a king, right? Because at first, God, of course, wants to be the king, and tells them they don't need one. But eventually, then God says yes, and God gives them a king. So theologically, you have this God that's very much in relationship with the people and in negotiation, in some ways, with the people. So the story kind of gears us to think about God as one of the, I mean, a very important player, but one of the players here at the table of all of these people doing things and making change, right? I'm encouraging you in this way to think about the theology that we see in the text or that we bring to the text, because the theology, the things that are said about God, of course, is not the same in different parts of Scripture. So you talk about the Davidic monarchy, here you very much have God embedded in the ruling of the people, right? But by God giving them a king, then they're sort of one step removed from that, right? So there's intimacy, but now there's a mediation. Right? So God takes a step, and in between then is another human being, and the human being is elevated. Right? So now we have theology, but now we also have kind of this character sketch of this very important king. And David, of course, lives for centuries, and there's nobody really like him. But there are other important kings, but there's nobody like David. He's got so many stories about him. You know, we get this like sort of little guy to old man trajectory of his life, right? And that makes him very unique in the Scriptures. So it says something about God, which we've just sort of talked about, but then it also says something about leadership. And you guys have talked about those issues too, that, you know, for David becoming king, you expect perhaps, that because God has ordained it and instituted it, it's going to go well. But then when the reality is that it doesn't. And it doesn't even go well even professionally some of the time. Well, it's not like he's great professionally and terrible personally. It's a messy thing all around. All the way around. So every time we have sort of human, that human mediator, right? Every time we have a human leader, then that's a consequence of that. Even if that person is given by God, and even if that person is connected to or seen as carrying out what God wants, that doesn't mean that's going to always go well. Even the best king, you know, that they've ever had, kind of thing. And I think that's that's an inheritance that we get as Christians when we inherit these scriptures and sort of our attitude towards human authority and leadership, what we can expect from that. Like you say, relating to. It's not that God can't work through those people. God does, but we can never expect those people then to be anything other than they are. And so David, I think that sketch of David, gives us kind of a model as we think about how we approach leadership. I'm not saying it's how it should be. I'm saying it's how it is because this is our heritage. Right? This is what we've inherited. So when God lets the people get their way, it's a very mixed bag.
I can almost hear him saying, well, this ain't gonna end well, but all right.
But all right. I promise not to give up on you. I promise not to give up on you, but this is not gonna go the way that you hope and that you think. I remember as a child, it took me a long time to figure out that the David that beat Goliath was the same David that got in trouble, from the prophet. Like, even though they had the same name, and even though maybe even I knew that they were connected, that integrating the two people into one took me a long time. Because as a child, you don't see those people connected to each other. It seems like there's so much promise and so much hope, in David who's faithful to God, right? But then in adulthood, all this messy stuff happens. So the story is very much about that, right? It's about God's relationship with the people, and then God giving them a king, and that the king being epitomized by David. So all of our conversations about David and about God are very legitimate, right? That's the point of the story. And that's what we're led to, by the way that the narrative is told. So you can spend decades reading what people think about God in the story and what they think about David in the story, because that's what we're intended to focus on, right? But then I think the edge and the part that I think in our era of biblical interpretation, people have said, well, but what about? Right? Well, what about some of these looser ends that don't get tied up? And so you can't read as much about Bathsheba, right? You can't read as much about these other kind of edges in the story. But they continue, and more people now, I think, are asking, okay, so we thought about all this other stuff, and that's all fine, but what do we do with all these edges in the story? This story does not about Bathsheba, right? She's not the point of the story. But does that mean that as readers, that we just let her be on the side? Or are we somehow responsible as readers for thinking about her? Like, what's our responsibility as readers of the story, as carriers of the tradition, to thinking about her or to caring about her? So I think that's where, biblical studies now, we used to talk about, I'm going to go on just a little bit of a tangent, but it's a good one. So let's just for a minute, just imagine, imagine this is the Bible, right? So for you guys, this is sort of before the Bible, right? And then this is the text, and then this is after the text. Used to be in biblical studies that we would say the true meaning of the Bible exists here. We have to get back to the people who wrote the Bible, what their lives were like, what they intended, and then we will know exactly what the text means. So what the text meant in its original context. So for generations, this is historical critical method. People figured out what's the meaning behind the text. Does that make sense? So then, several decades ago, people decided, that's interesting, but that's not all of it. Because the text itself has a meaning, sort of independent of this. A literary meaning, let's say. A narrative meaning. Like, stories have a life, even without all of this stuff. So people started to study the literary forms that the Bible came in, and what we know about other literary forms at the same time. And then they call that the meaning within the text itself. It's not that this stuff wasn't interesting, it was, but that there was also some sort of inherent meaning that came in the text. And that meaning may even be different than what the original author intended, right? That doesn't mean it's not true, but it might not be the same. This is what we all did in high school English, right? Where we read something We might have been interested in what the original author, maybe the teacher told us, but really we were all sort of reading the text itself, talking about its forms and that kind of thing. Yeah? Literary kind of criticism. So we have historical criticism and we have literary criticism. Now we are in an era where we are starting to understand that we probably will never actually know what the author intended. And even if we know all of the historical context we can, that's still only a tiny fraction of what actually existed. So this is really limited. And even if we know the literary forms and the genres and the way that literature was put together, a lot of that interpretation rests with us. Like what we think that piece of literature means. So now biblical criticism has started to take seriously the world in front of the text. That's y'all and me and people all over the world who interpret the Bible. So that's the meaning in front of the text. When this first started happening, these guys got all mad. They were all guys. And they said, this is a bad idea because you're just making the Bible say whatever you want it to say. Right? And these people said, well, what we're doing is we're being honest. That this is what you guys were doing too. We are all a part of this interpretive thing together. So the historical stuff matters and the literary stuff matters, but we matter too. I go on that tangent to say that obviously, historically, Bathsheba's not all that important, right? David's the one who matters. And literarily, what the text is trying to do here is teach us about God and about David, about leadership. But the people doing that bring something to the story. So as more women interpret the text, right, and as different groups of people interpret the text who are from the margins, what do they see and what do they notice? And that's why, even though the text isn't necessarily about Bathsheba, right, that becomes now a very important part of our interpretation of the text. Does that make sense? What you just said?
Yeah.
So it's not as though we're saying that an interpretation of Bathsheba is the definitive interpretation of the text. We're saying that we come to this with our own stories, our own biases, our own ways of living. So we negotiate with the text and with history to come up with a communal meaning that shifts over time. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is very, I say, this is really important and good for Lutherans. Like this fits in with how we've always read the Bible, but it is very threatening to a lot of traditions. Because the idea that there's no one meaning behind a text, that if we just dig deep enough in the dirt and we'll find it, right? That's scary. Because there's got to be one meaning, and if we just dig far enough, we'll find it. That's the bedrock of a lot of ways that people read the Bible. So this kind of interpretation, what we're doing right now in this world in front of the text, that leaves it much more, it's harder work, and it leaves it much more open to more people to contribute to the text. Yeah?
And it lets you get a more personal relationship with the text as well.
And be honest about that, right? To be honest about what you bring to the text, and that's okay. You know, you can say, well, I as a blah 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 bring this perspective to the text, so this is what stands out, you know, to me. And it's not that yours gets to be definitive, but yours in conversation with mine and everyone else's makes a fuller, richer picture. Okay? Some people say, who criticize this kind of interpretation, say, you guys obsess about people like Bathsheba when the text is clearly not about Bathsheba. Obviously. No one is arguing that point. What we're saying is the meaning of the text grows bigger the more people who read it. And certain people will be, when their life is superimposed on the text, certain things will stand out that didn't stand out before. So then let's with all of that in mind. So then let's talk about Bathsheba in terms of the text. Did you write about Bathsheba? What did you, if you thought about her or wrote about her, what'd you say?
Well, that she doesn't seem to be a big consideration, of course. She's just described as the object of David's desire, but I wondered about her, how she felt about the whole thing, what might have been going through her head.
She's a victim.
if she even wanted to deny David, would she have been able to?
Mhm.
Because after all, he was the king.
Right. You know, that's a big question. And so some people have been hesitant to, and other people have really wanted to use the rape word, you know, to talk about this scene, and wondered if that's appropriate or inappropriate, and how does that change it if you introduce that concept of rape here. Whether Bathsheba had the ability to resist and say no, not likely.
Or would she have even thought that that was an option because of the way the culture was?
Right, right.
So you submit.
Mm-hmm.
No, it seems like Uriah was a very good man. I mean, he was a good captain in the army. He was a good follower of the king. Probably a very good husband too.
Yeah, the story goes out of the way to say he's a good guy.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so the likelihood is that she was happy with her marriage. So she was a victim as much as anybody else is.
Right. And so that, in a way, that deepens the story and complexifies it. Because who does the story say that David sins against?
Uriah.
Right. The sin of David is taking Uriah's wife. The sin of David is not raping a woman. Yeah. And so to me, that's really significant.
Well, there the two rapes in the story. I mean, and you don't know anything about them. I mean, there's nothing more about either woman, really.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so you see this, you know, story told from this particular perspective where it's, you know, these guys and their lives and their careers, it's all told from that kind of perspective. And so, you know, Nathan is the agent of God in the story. Nathan comes and says, Ata Ha'ish, you are the man. Right? He tells the story about this lamb and it's awful, you know, and he says, who is this man? Well, you are the man. And in that way, it's like, go Nathan, right? He's the defender, of truth. But Nathan's message is to him, not that you disrespected a woman or that you violated somebody and took her body when you weren't supposed to. It's that you disrespected a man. Yeah. And so that kind of interpretation leads to a little bit different, I think, positionality toward the text. Because if I'm reading along with the text and I'm siding with Nathan and it's all good, right? So you get to that point and I am a consenting or assenting reader to the points and the themes of the text. Yes, David's a bad guy. Yes, you know, Uriah's a good guy. And yes, Nathan speaks for God and all that. So I'm an assenting or consenting reader the whole time. If you take that situation with Bathsheba and you kind of put that up against the story, now I become what one biblical scholar calls kind of a resisting reader of the text. That says, okay, wait. So God's mad that he stole Uriah's wife, but God's not mad that he violated this woman? Okay, this point right here, this little hinge that we're making,
disconnect.
Right? That's different. It's a different way to read Scripture. I'm highlighting this on purpose for you just to show you that shift between being largely a consenting reader and a resisting reader. Okay? Both ways of reading the Bible are faithful ways of reading the Bible, right? Because both take seriously and say the Bible has something important to say here. But there is a nuance and there's a difference between that. Okay? The woman who coined that phrase and talked about being a resisting reader of the Bible, she was actually talking about John. And she's a Jew. So when she reads John and the criticism of the Jews, she talks about that shift from becoming a happily along, I'm sure the Bible's right about everything, right, to this little hinge point of becoming a resisting reader. And a resisting reader doesn't automatically say that every detail of the Bible is going to sit right with you. Okay? So in other words, stories that talk about slavery. Right? That when I was a kid, it was sort of like, okay, well, we're just not going to talk about the fact that these people were slaves. We're just going to skip that part. Right?
Minor detail.
Yeah. But as an adult or as a young adult, when I was reading the Bible more as a kind of a thinking person and I got to those points, I didn't know what to do with that because I was raised in America where slavery is wrong. And I didn't understand or know how to sort of incorporate that into the way that I read the Bible. Okay, but I really like this term of being a resisting reader. It's not a rejecting reader, but it's a resisting reader. To say, not so fast. We have to think this through, and we have to, we can't just let everything go by, and just assume that it's all, we can just swallow it the way that it is and then move on to the next story. Right? So that's part of what I think trained readers of the Bible, and everybody resists on different things. If you come from a part of the world where slavery is a real thing, right, then you're going to resist different parts of the story and say, this stands out to me. So that doesn't mean that that those parts of the Bible, you just cut them out, or you say, I can't take any of the Bible. But really, that's where, when the Bible then comes into contact with the real world, like the world that we're living in right now, then those are the points of friction and discussion that we say. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean. Right? So that we take different stands, even perhaps, than what we would read in Scripture. And that's okay. It's okay to read the stories and say, these parts create friction with our world now. And that we need to speak against that. Like, we can't just let that go. So the very fact that the story is told about men and about this part of the world, right, and then Bathsheba isn't really a part of that, or she's just basically part of the plot, and she's the plot device, right, that moves everything forward. We can say that that's not something that we will continue to accept, or things that don't bother us, they do bother us. Okay. So having that sort of resisting reading posture towards Scripture, I think is a faithful way to be. And if you teach high school kids or junior high kids, they understand this. We teach them not to pay attention to this, right? They notice these things. And then in confirmation and in high school Sunday school, we tell them, well, you're not supposed to pay attention to that. You're supposed to pay attention to the point of the story. And then we wonder why when they become young adults, they don't think that we have any integrity when it comes to Scripture. Mm-hmm. So at least being able to talk about this and label it for what it is, I think it really helps people who are kind of growing in their faith and their relationship with the Bible when you can talk about these kind of problematic stories this way. Thoughts about that? I've talked a lot, so I'm slowing down. One of the reasons why I like this story in particular, for thinking this through, and for talking about it with people that you might teach or at Bible studies that you might be in, is because later interpreters do include Bathsheba. Like, they don't run over her as just a plot device. She becomes a symbol. For the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, she's a symbol. I don't know if you remember this, but in the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew, when it says all the generations back, right? You're going through history, and Matthew includes women in the genealogy of Jesus who have no business being there. They have, they're basically out of bounds, but they get included, all the way down to, of course, Mary, right? That weird thing that happens about Jesus' birth, right? But the wife of Uriah, she's not called by name, but the wife of Uriah is in the genealogy, and her name is included, which is weird. Normally in a genealogy, you wouldn't bother with women. You certainly wouldn't highlight the irregularities. So you would smooth that over so that it looks really nice and pretty. But the writer of Matthew goes ahead and includes Rahab, right? And the writer of the Gospel of Matthew goes ahead and includes the wife of Uriah. So Bathsheba gets included later by interpreters to make Jesus' story bumpier. Like if you could leave those people out, it would look a lot nicer. But the inclusion of the women, and a lot of people have wondered what the writer of Matthew's doing there. I don't, like I said, we don't always know the intent of the writer, but the result is that Jesus' story is a lot bumpier. It's a lot messier. So rather than just going right through and including David, right, it says David by the wife of Uriah. So she gets to be a part of the story later. So even though she's not terribly important in that part of the story, she gets included later. So I think this kind of story is really helpful for that, because the wrinkles in the story live on. So even if we try to pretend that they're not there, or we sort of gloss over them, then later interpreters included it, and the point is that it's bumpier. I also think it's helpful to, there have been times when I've heard interpretations of the story that have focused on, David and Bathsheba sinning together, and then that produces like this, so it's sort of this communal sin between the two of them, and possibly, right? Because if the interpretation of the text is that Bathsheba is a willing participant and leaves her husband to go with David, then there's kind of this. I just think it's a little too easy with women in the Bible to always associate their behavior with sin, and particularly sexual sin. So just our tendency to do that, I think, needs to be just paused sometimes and say, what is it that makes us make that assumption every time there's a woman in the text? It's like Jesus was a woman at the well, and all those kinds of stories. A woman in the city who washes Jesus' feet. We have decided that she's somehow a sexual sinner, even though that story doesn't say so. There's something in us that attaches that.
So, there's Mary Magdalene too.
Mm-hmm. Right, of whom 7 demons had gone out. Right, well, we don't know anything about those. But of course, the association down through the ages becomes that she was a prostitute, which is a later interpretation of the text, but doesn't actually live there. All right. So you have read all of the content about the monarchy, and having been just in the Holy Land, it's really interesting to see how that era, lives and is very important for the state of Israel in terms of thinking about itself now, like the attachment to the land and to royalty and to this idea of the promised land and the fulfillment in David and in of course, Solomon's temple. That becomes sort of the golden age in the era of, when we were really us kind of life. So I should have focused on these texts. Is there anything else from the rest of that you wanted to bring up and to talk through?
Nathan was intrigued me because here he's got to go confront a man who's in great power and has already killed somebody on his way. And you've got to feel like God's with you to do that.
That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to inhabit people in the story without power, right? In addition to Bathsheba, Nathan is a good one. Nathan is, Uriah is a good guy, but things just sort of happen to Uriah, right? Nathan is asked to stand up to power. He's asked to use his voice and his body to be in the presence and to call the king out. Yeah.
I'm just marveled at, you're looking at, what was that, 1500 BC, somewhere around there? And here we are today, and you see the same kind of temperament of people. I mean, how have we really evolved as a people? Since then, you still see that greed and that lust and that power.
Impetuousness.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Kind of solving one problem and creating 10. By right? Sort of being in trouble, so needing to solve this problem, and by extension, creating 10 more problems. Yeah. Which circles back to what you guys talked about at the beginning of the class in terms of when you settle for a human king. This is what you get.
Yeah.
You get a human king.
You get a very human king. Yeah. And even if you're, it's hard for us sometimes, I think, to relate to kings and king language. But I think even though we have democracy, it's not just one, we have many people who inhabit lots of power in our country. country, and you see that kind of compromised sense of integrity or something in, throughout our history. And it could be on a bunch of different scales. Not pointing at anybody in particular. Yeah. Okay, anything else then about Davidic monarchy? Kind of the separation and fall out. Okay, so then the next thing that we're going to talk about is what happens after all of this falls apart. Okay? So when you talk about the Holy Land and you go to the Holy Land, basically everywhere you go, they tell you which empire this is from. And they just start to list all the empires from start to finish. So after this Davidic monarchy and down through Solomon, and then it kind of all falls apart, the Assyrians are the major threat. They're the ones that have come down and caused havoc. When they are sort of freed from the Assyrians, they think, oh, this is great, now we're going to be on our own. But then it's a very short time, and then the Babylonians arrive. And the Babylonians are basically in a fight with Egypt for who controls this area. So you end up in the time of Jeremiah, you end up with this struggle for power. And the kings who are in charge at that time, and this is Judah we're talking specifically about, because Assyria took care of the others, the lost tribes, right? So Judah in this time period has to decide, do we acquiesce and try to deal with the Babylonians? B, do we side with the Egyptians and then make the Babylonians mad? Or C, and this is what Jeremiah wants, stay true to God and never mind all the earthly powers. Jeremiah is very consistent that, it's not a good idea to play with these empires. But of course, the earthly kings, if you imagine yourself in their positions, they're like, that's nice, but these people have armies, right?
Yeah.
They're fighting each other and we're going to die in the middle of all of this. So what ends up happening is that Babylon becomes the dominant global power of the time. And the kings of Judah try their best to sort of switch sides and now play nice with the Babylonians. But when it comes down to it, Babylon destroys them and sends a bunch of them off into exile. It's not everybody. If you were a conquering imperial power and you were going to send people into exile, who would you send?
I mean, the dregs of society, really.
You could do it that way, or what would be your...
Or you send the most powerful.
Right, you take the leaders. You take the smart people, you take the people in charge, and you send them off into your land, right? Because then you take away the people you've conquered, you take away their leadership and any will to resist, and you gain the best of them into your culture. So they took anywhere from 10% to maybe 25% of the people who lived there, and they took the richest and smartest and the most powerful people and took them away. So basically all that's left at that time in the land of Judah are farmers, people who can continue to grow food so you can tax them. Right? You just keep doing what you're doing and we'll just take over the leadership part. And we'll continue to take your money. We'll make sure that you give us 50 to 60% of everything you grow, but you can stay. And then all the people who were your leaders, you guys get sent off into exile. So the key date to remember here is 587. 587. It happened. It was not a definitive Tuesday morning, it's all over exile. It was a process. But 587 is the year that we point to say this is the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the carting off of the exiles into Babylon. 587 becomes a hinge point in the history of these people, in the history of the Jews. Because up until now, ever since they had left Egypt, they were building towards something. They had been given what? When they left Egypt, what were they going to get finally?
Land.
The land, right? Yeah. Moses sees it from Mount Nebo, he doesn't get to cross over, everybody else does. Oh crap, there's people here, so then there's wars, right? Joshua and Judges, we have to get rid of all the other people who are here. They finally get it all established, then they get the king, then they build the temple. This is a big deal, right? They finally get everything that they feel that God's promised them. And then in 587, boom, it's done. So the attachment of the people to the land is fundamentally questioned from after 587 on. Because the inheritance of the people of the land, they always had the book too, right? I mean, they always had the Torah, they had the law. But the attachment to the land was kind of the promise. And you could always look at Jerusalem and say, see, God is faithful. So after 587, when they get sent off into exile, the leaders of the nation get sent off into exile, everything changes. It's not that nobody's left, but the tradition, the people who carry the religious tradition are gone. So what we have, the things that we have been given here, in terms of the Bible, is looked at from the perspective of the people who went into exile and then came back. What we have is not the people who stayed behind. We have the people who left and then look back fondly, nostalgically, at that time when they were able to inhabit the land. And then they, of course, have questioned this fundamental, there's been a rupture between the relationship of God's people and the land. How are we to sing the songs of Zion when we are here in Babylon? That's a psalm quotation. It's one of the fundamental questions of the era. Right? So you'll hear a lot of times when you read Bible books and people talking about the Bible, they'll talk about exilic, E-X-I-L-I-C, and post-exilic. Those are really fancy words that have to do with this time period, right? What did the people think and feel about God during the exile and then when they got to come home? So we look at how the tradition changed from that time. While they were in exile, the people who were there, the leadership, the intelligentsia, the religious leadership, of course, what's going to become important to them?
Getting back.
Yeah, and the stories that came with them. So while they're there, they look at all these, stories of the people, and they start to put them together because they don't want anything to happen to them. So they start to put them together, and that is the form of the stories that we inherit. Okay, so the Deuteronomic history that we get is exilic. They're looking back at what happened, and then they're putting it in some kind of narrative. They didn't change the stories, but they're the reason that we have the two creation stories that's next to each other. Because they say, okay, we have these two creation stories, now we want to see them. Now we want to put them together because they both say something, each one says something important about who we are and our relationship to God. So these priestly writers put together then the stories in a way to hand down to people. Because they don't have the land anymore, they don't have the temple, they don't have the place, so now the narrative becomes really important. You can see how that happens, right? Like,
You want to preserve what you lost somewhere or another.
Right. And if you can't go to the place, then we're going to tell you all about it. Make sure you don't lose that. Right? I learned stories about the farm where my great-grandpa came from in Sweden because the assumption is we weren't going back there. So they told me stories about where we came from in Sweden. Okay. So, what?
It's okay.
Yes, okay. I was just talking about how I grew up with hearing stories about Sweden as this place where I would never go. but it was this place where I was from. And so I was given this sort of repository of here's these little anecdotes that have to do with your family history. And so in the exile, they start to put all of these things together so that they have a tradition, something they can carry on. Okay? So those are a lot of that's why we get the stories in the order that we do, because that's where they wanted to do it. And that was about the time it became important to make the book a book. Like the story is a story, one huge narrative. Make sense? Okay. So it depended on when you went into exile, whether you were there 40 or close to 70 years. But if you go between 40 and 70 years, you can imagine that the people who came back had actually never lived there. Back, right? So they come back to a place where they've never been, armed with these stories of what it was. So you can imagine then what that feels like, a sort of post-exilic era. You carry this tradition that your ancestors gave to you, but this is not your home necessarily. And what prompted them to be able to go home? It's not that the Babylonians woke up one day and said, "Oh, we're sorry, you get to go home." No, the Persians beat them, and the Persians had a different way of dealing with religious minorities than the Babylonians did. So Cyrus the Great let them go back. So they considered Cyrus the Great to be sent from God. Some even called him the Anointed One, the Messiah, because he let them go home. So while they're in exile, that's when you get a lot of this exilic writing, and you go back and you can read the Deuteronomic history from their standpoint. And then after they get back, now they have to decide what they're going to do. If you were coming back and you have been given all of this tradition, and now you've got the place back as well, then you might imagine that rebuilding becomes really important. So the two figures that rise, and the two people who are really important there are Ezra and Nehemiah. One is a priest and one is a governor. And the stories that they have are of the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the community. And this is important, the rebuilding of the borders, the boundaries between God's people and other people. When you go into exile, it's not like you can maintain all of your, you're probably going to marry the neighbor down the street's kid, right? Mm-hmm. So they intermarry, a lot of things happen like that. When they come back, it becomes very important to establish boundaries again around the people. Cultural boundaries, religious boundaries, physical boundaries. So a lot of that era of writing, reading into the Chronicles of Ezra and Nehemiah, have to do with sort of establishing that around the people again. So over and over again in the history of God's people, you have this, we are set apart, but there are a lot of cracks. We are set apart, but then we get sent into exile and it gets all messy. We are set apart, right? So it's this tension between God's people being set apart and different, and then the constant sort of infiltration with the world. Neither is right or wrong. It's just the tension that's always existed in God's people and in the Bible. So that's why you get these diatribes about the Edomites or the Moabites or whatever. It's like, stay away because we're God's people. And at the same time, you end up with a constant mixing of everybody. Okay. So Ezra and Nehemiah come, and the whole point becomes the rebuilding of the temple. One of my favorite parts of that story is in Ezra when they talk about laying the cornerstone of the new temple. And basically the text says, they laid the cornerstone of the new temple, and half of the people wept for joy, and half of the people wept for grief over the loss of the old temple. And the noise was so loud and it mixed, and you could not tell who was weeping for joy and who was weeping for grief. And I often think that sounds like the church, right? That sounds like who we are, what we do. Okay, so that section of scripture, Ezra and Nehemiah Chronicles, is about that sort of rebuilding time. Okay, so now they try to sort of go back, but of course there's no going back. So from then on in, it's this tension between staying faithful to God and God staying faithful to the people. I want to go back just a little bit to say, so the major prophetic voice prior to the exile, like in the time when it was all kind of falling apart, that's Jeremiah. Jeremiah is, because you have this sort of historical stuff happening at the same time as the prophetic stuff, so that's why it gets a little messy here towards the end of this section. So Jeremiah is the one that says, you guys aren't remaining faithful to God, God's going to punish you, it's all going to fall apart, right? Jeremiah is the doom and gloom guy. He has deep, deep love for God and for God's people, but it's just bad, right? Jeremiah, it's just bad. So he's the one, who weeps over the destruction of Jerusalem, right? Then in this tension between God being faithful to the people and are the people faithful to God, that's Isaiah. So that's why we end up with these prophetic parts of Isaiah that have to do with God sending somebody, God sending someone, and that we are a part of being faithful to God and God's response to us. So Isaiah is the one that sort of deals with that tension. Jeremiah is all that. Isaiah is much more about, oh, but wait, God will preserve the promise through a certain group of people, and it'll continue on after that. So the time under the Persians, if you watch a lot of those kind of movies, you know that the Persians are always in fights with the Greeks, right? So eventually Alexander the Great rises to power, and he takes over, defeats everybody else around, and the Hellenistic influence, the Hellenistic Empire, kind of takes over into that area, and then that's the phase that carries us through the intertestamental period. So Alexander the Great's influence is the reason why we shift to everybody speaking Greek and reading Greek, all the educated people. So once we get to that point, then that's why the Bible is read in Greek, and that's why Greek is the language of commerce, why people are. So that shift takes place. We started today with Assyria, and then Egypt and Babylon duked it out. Babylon wins. Then we go through to Persians, and then Alexander. So that's why Greek ends up being the language that's spoken. So when you read these texts, it's almost like you have to put the religious and the political side by side. I still hear a lot from people that they like to keep their church and their politics separate. And that may work for you, but that doesn't work for the Bible. So when you read the Bible, the church and the political world, and the religious tradition and the political world, they are so intertwined. Everything is a response to what's happening. You can't understand Jeremiah unless you understand what Jeremiah was seeing and how the people were, reacting to that. So I always resist a little bit when people want to say that politics doesn't have any place in church. I'm not saying politics has one place in church. What I'm saying, it's really hard to read the Bible and not talk about politics or history. Right? And it gets messy when you do that. But it also just helps you understand why the tradition grows the way it does. So that's the last part I want to talk about this morning. In your book, if you have your book, I'm on page 391. And there's a nice list on this page that I think can help us sort of make the transition between what theology was like under David and under the monarchy, and then what theology is like by the time we get to Jesus. That's a long period of time. I know that's 500 years. But a lot of things happen in the middle of there. But there's a discernible shift that takes place because of the exile and because of what it means to live away from the temple, that you can see how, because of the politics and the history, how the theology shifts. Okay, so on 391, if there's a list of 10 things. I like these 10 things. And it says these are shifts in prophecy, but I also think they're just shifts in general theology, like the way people thought about their religious tradition. So 1, a stronger stress on individual responsibility and righteous behavior. 2, a growing emphasis on monotheism, in which God is the sole power that controls the actions of pagan nations as well as Israel. 3, a fuller sharing by the prophet in the suffering of the people, and frequent suffering for them, as in the cases of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and 2nd Isaiah. A comparison to Moses as a mediator between God and the people, especially in the prophets of the exile. The beginning of hope by the prophets for a new covenant in which God will give people the power to live it rather than depend on the strength of Israel's own willpower. More and more emphasis on the law of Moses, or the book of the law, as a written body of guides to life. The view of the remnant as not just those whom God allows to escape punishment and destruction, but a faithful group of men and women who deserve to be saved. The belief that God will make Jerusalem and Zion the center of a renewed earth, and that Israel will be the leader of the world. The belief, especially in post-exilic prophets, that this will be followed by the conversion or conquest of the Gentiles and their submission to God in Zion. And 10, the belief that this time of glory may be long in coming, but it will be a time marked by the fulfillment of God's promises to David. This to me, if you remember nothing else that I said today, this to me characterizes the shift between what you read for today and where we end up by the end of the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. Because this is the shift that goes from a nationalistic, God-ordained, earthly power, we show our faithfulness to God because God showed faithfulness to us, right? To, it's all kind of confusing and we're not really sure, and what we thought was going to happen didn't happen. So now we have to figure out who we're going to be. I think that this list, and kind of the mess of the exilic and post-exilic writers, is where we can often find ourselves in the story. Because this kind of personal, individual responsibility and righteous behavior, the idea that God preserves a remnant to be a light to the nations, right? This sort of intersects with how we have understood ourselves as well. So I like this particular list because it shows kind of what happens when the tradition breaks down and fractures into pieces, and that we are then kind of just trying to figure it out in the middle of everything else. I think that speaks to kind of our time in history and where we see ourselves as a religious tradition. Because we've been around a long time. The kind of things we thought might happen haven't exactly happened in terms of creating sort of Christian nations. That didn't really go very well in Europe, and it hasn't really gone very well here. And what does that mean, and what does it mean to be faithful to God? So I like this kind of messy time period, even though we don't talk about it very much in script in church. I like the texts because they speak to that, kind of making it up as we go and trying to stay faithful to who God is. And it also speaks to living in a sort of pluralistic world. What does it mean to live in a world of difference? You'll see, of course, the diffusion of energy out and away from Jerusalem, because it isn't so much about the temple anymore. They rebuild it, but now we've been out. So there is such a thing as a Jewish diaspora. So before that, pretty much everybody who was a Jew lived in the same place. After the exile, you have these communities that are out, and not everybody chooses to come back. So now Judaism isn't just defined by people who live in this place that go to this temple and worship this God. Now they're out, and they're doing these other things. So Judaism has to be defined by different behaviors, maybe, or the books that they read, right? So you just see the development of the tradition and the importance of Scripture that takes precedence, after the exile. So that's where I sort of come to. By the end of the Hebrew Bible, by the end of the texts that we have this sort of very Hellenistic influence. The world is very big, and it's kind of at their front door. And they have been through this exile, they've been through the destruction of their entire tradition. They have rebuilt what they can of it, but it is not, it's not the same. And there is this sense that it's precarious, like it's not gonna live forever. And now there's this influence, or this, emphasis, I would say, on individual, personal responsibility or righteousness that wasn't always a hallmark of things before. We have come, it's so hard to come 1,500 years, right? You go all the way from the oldest stories all the way up to here. It seems very unfair because you barely just skim the surface as you hop down. So I tried to show you, in addition to the history, just sort of those theological themes as we drop down into different things. All right, thoughts or questions about that?
You have some that chose not to return,
You got these two different communities, you know, here and there. Was there any, you know, continual dialogue between them in terms of preserving traditions, or?
Well, and that's what's so interesting, I think, about what you end up seeing in the time of early Christianity, right? Because there are Jewish communities in Turkey, there are Jewish communities in Greece, and what are they doing and how are they preserving the tradition? What does it look like there, and how is it different, you know, from what it would have been? Now, I mean, the people who ended up, Jerusalem always loomed large, especially because there was a temple that, after Ezra and Nehemiah built it all the way until 70. So there was a sense that there was still a center of gravity there, and that if you could, you know, get into Jerusalem was a big deal. But the religion could flourish far away. And so the book becomes the thing. Like the law in the book and the way to be and to be separate from the community, distinct from the community in certain ways, that's what it boiled down to. So that's why the rabbis take on, you know, greater influence, especially after the destruction of the temple. They become a big deal because they're the ones who hold the book, you know, and they bring the tradition forward. So it became about lifestyle, the sort of individual responsibility and piety, righteousness. That influence continued, and the farther away you were, in a sense, you know, the more you wanted to keep those behaviors up because you set yourself apart from the people that were around you. It always, you know, surprises me when we would go to Turkey, and we were out in the middle of a site, you know, that was totally Greek and Roman, and then you'd come upon a stone and there was a menorah on it. It's like they were here, you know, they were small and they were different, and they were not in power, but they were here, and they were clear on who they were. Now, did that look the same everywhere? Of course not. And they probably, like, you know, like in my house, we do St. Lucia in December, right? Because we're Swedish Lutherans, but you don't have to do St. Lucia to be Lutheran, right? So there were certain sort of local realities. But the crux of the thing and holding on to the teaching of Torah becomes, I emphasized before, you know, the sense of Torah, the teaching of the people, becoming the identity of the people. But that's what continued to set them apart. And of course, for our purposes, that becomes a really interesting comparison to what the early Christians did. How important is it for Christians to set themselves apart from the communities that they inhabit? This is why Paul argues with everybody about circumcision, about eating vegetables, right? Because Christians who come out of that Jewish tradition have this positionality with respect to culture. Well, what are Christians going to be? Because they're not the same as Jews, even though some of them are Jews. Some of them are not. So how are we going to react to this wider sort of Greco-Roman world? The Jews have kind of figured that out, and then Christians have to decide how they're going to be, because they invite Greeks to become a part of them. And so then who do we become? So a lot of this argument that you only get one side, you know, from Paul, but that's a lot of that kind of argument. And it's also what John of Patmos in Revelation is so upset about in a lot of those, when he's mad at the people, when he says to the Laodiceans, you're neither hot nor cold. I didn't realize until I went there that that's actually over a hot springs, so that's why he said that. I spit you out because you're lukewarm, right? But he says that to say, you can't make up your mind whether you're going to be different or you're going to be just like everybody else. Like you don't even know who you are. And that is a lot of the question for the people going forward. Okay, so history, prophecy, theology, it all weaves together, and it gets really complicated here at the end. But thank you for sort of skimming over the top and hopping down with me at different points. The final project is for you to take a text that you've been familiar with before, and then to read it now differently. And that's a loose assignment. It's in your syllabus. It's a loose assignment, but I want you to think through some of it. It could be this thing that we did today about interpretation of the text behind, within, or in front of. It could be what we've talked about in terms of exile and return, and maybe reading one of those prophetic texts that we've done before that would come from Isaiah, or if they come from, the Psalms. Use your book as a guide to, to send you to some of those texts, to engage one of those texts, or to maybe take one that we talked about today in terms of that resisting reader pose. Choose a text that before you've always kind of had a thing with, and read it as a resisting reader, and explore it that way. And then think about what are the implications of teaching this, and what do we have to be careful of teaching something like this or reading something like this. Right? So taking an Old Testament or Hebrew Bible text, thinking through it through the lens of this class and the things that we've learned, and then talking about how your interpretation now has changed or might be different given what you've started to think differently about. Okay, and I think I said a month. I'm double checking the syllabus. Yeah, so December 19th, and this is 3 to 5 pages. And I said in the syllabus, you can either email this to me or snail mail it to my church. And the address is at the top of the syllabus. The Trinity's address is at the top of the syllabus. So if you'd rather just send it in the mail to me, to my office, that's fine. Or you can email it to me. And then if you want feedback on the stuff you've given me, and that would include the final project, make sure you write an address if you send it to me at my church, so that I can get feedback back to you. If you send it to me via email, obviously I can get back to you. So just make sure you provide a way for me to provide feedback to you. Okay, questions about that? I really appreciated the thought that you put into the work that you've done. I haven't had a chance to, I kind of prefer to look at them all as a group and then kind of get back to you all at once, because I like to look at sort of the progression and the way that your thinking moves throughout the times that we spend together. So I'll get that to you as a present. Okay. That's all. Thank you very much.